Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. So today we're going to go on with our exploration of George VI and Elizabeth. They were a couple that worked and loved together and made the perfect team. So George VI needed the strength of Elizabeth and her undying love to help him after he became the king. He may have doubted his abilities, but he proved his father right by being the best king England could have hoped for. So after the ceremony, when he became king, George VI made a declaration, and then he said, "With my wife as helpmeet by my side, I take up the heavy task which lies before me." When George VI got home, in a sweet gesture, his daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, they did a drop elegant curtsies for him. The king didn't know how to react, and then he kissed them, and Bertie and Elizabeth stopped the tradition of having the children curtsy to them, but the girls would still do it for Queen Mary. So Bertie had doubts. He told Louis Mountbatten that he felt quite unprepared for his new role, and the book George VI and Elizabeth stated that the king had gotten in his experience through the years. He knew the industrial workers, and he had great powers of observation, and Bertie had been with his father more than his brothers had, and he saw how his father handled things. So the first few weeks, of course, were emotional shocks to both Bertie and Elizabeth. Bertie stayed out of the public because he was in such turmoil about his new position. And then Bertie leaned on Elizabeth, but she too was shaken up. She didn't like David leaving the throne, and she said that his departure was like a heavy blow to the head. And she wrote to friends, though, that the curious thing is, we're not afraid. So once things started to settle down a bit, December 22nd, the king, the queen, the princesses, and Queen Mary took a train to Sandringham for Christmas. They had crowds of people cheering them on. And all the stress got to Queen Mary, and she ended up having a respiratory infection. She went to her bedroom on Christmas Eve and stayed there until New Year's Eve. Elizabeth told Victor Cazalet that the abdication very nearly killed poor Queen Mary. There is indeed such a thing as a broken heart, and hers is very nearly collapsed. So we have the brothers' relationship is kind of torn up. When Bertie was in Norfolk for 6 weeks, he found out two things that would make him see his brother David in a different light. So months before Edward VIII abdicated, he secretly arranged to sell 2 tracts of land on the Sandringham estate, the Amner and Fletcham farms, to a prominent family in Lincolnshire. Bertie instructed his land agent to stop the sale, and it wasn't an easy task because the contract had been signed. But the land agent was able to do it, and Bertie was angry with David. And David also made Bertie believe that he didn't have very many assets. But then Bertie found out he had a private Duchy of Cornwall fortune of more than £1 million that he had hidden. So David had stated to Bertie that his assets amounted to only £90,000, which was a fraction of what his real wealth was. He also insisted that he needed an annual payment of £25,000 tax-free for the life as a private citizen. So Bertie at that time was distracted by all that was going on and had agreed to it. But Bertie, when he found out, wrote to David in early 1937, "I understand from you when I signed the paper at the fort that you were going to be very badly off. The fact remains that I was completely misled." Bertie told David that he was no longer entitled to the annual pension, and the British government refused to pay David out the Treasury funds. So David started to play rough and wouldn't release the Sandringham and Balmoral properties, and he was holding them hostage. Negotiations went on for more than a year, and a settlement was finally reached in 1938. So Bertie ended up paying David £25,000 a year from his own pocket, and he bought out his brother's investment in the 2 estates for almost £300,000. So the king always had a fear that David and Wallis would return to England and try to stir up trouble and undermine how he was doing as king. Bertie's family didn't trust David either. Prince George, who was David's favorite brother, told Bertie, "Don't ever let David come back. He'll only cause you trouble." So George VI had the government secure that David could not travel to Britain without the king's permission, and if he did, he would have his pension payments taken away. David agreed, but he wasn't happy about it. He said the arrangement was unfair and intolerable, tantamount to my accepting payments for remaining in exile. David thought that his brother would allow him to come back to Britain after a few years and resume his life at Fort Belvedere, but Bertie only said that to David before the abdication, and it was under informal circumstances. And David, he would call Bertie when the time wasn't right for Bertie to talk, and he would offer advice to Bertie which wasn't asked for, but the main reason David called was to ask for money. and he wanted Wallis to be named Her Royal Highness after their marriage. So this would make Bertie upset. And finally, Elizabeth asked Walter Monckton to get the Duke to stop calling. So February the 15th, they moved to Buckingham Palace. Bertie lived there for 13 years before he got married. And according to the book George VI and Elizabeth, the palace was more like an office complex than a home. And at first, Princess Elizabeth wasn't sure she liked the palace. She wondered if a tunnel could be dug so that they could sleep in their old house. A week later, she had a change of heart, and Queen Mary noted that Elizabeth and Margaret were delighted for the wide passages to play in. And Queen Mary, she moved in too, and she wanted to plan the redecoration. Her and the Queen Mother, Elizabeth, would go from room to room for hours. And then there was like a depression going on, so Elizabeth was being prudent with the finances. But once it was done, George VI said that Elizabeth could make a home anywhere, and he said that with a smile. So there was differences between Bertie and his father. George VI, as his father did, had family values, but unlike his father, he was more visibly devoted to his wife than George V had been. He had dominated Queen Mary, but Elizabeth was George's confidant. Bertie's father, George V, intimidated his children, while Bertie doted on Lilibet and Margaret. Bertie had his mother's reserve. He knew how to listen to people. And when Bertie was with people, he knew he didn't have any problem speaking. Elizabeth was always enjoying herself, and she did more relaxed entertaining. The knee breeches that were at parties were eliminated, and instead trousers were worn. And when Bertie had been king for 6 months, he treated his courtiers like friends. George V would hold meetings with his prime ministers, and George V said little to them, but Bertie would tackle all the documents in his dispatch boxes, and he would analyze and make his own judgments on matters. So now we come to Prince Margaret and Elizabeth's education. Marion Crawford was their governess, and tutors were brought in to supplement it. Tutors for French, German, music, and dancing. The king changed the classroom from a gloomy room to one that was sunny on the top floor, and it overlooked the gardens. Crawfie, as Crawford was known, wanted them to have knowledge taught to them as quickly as possible, but Elizabeth didn't want the girls too burdened by school. Queen Mary was of another thought. She was determined that they be educated, and Crawfie would give progress reports and lesson plans to Queen Mary. So that was wise of Queen Mary. The Christmas speech, when he was first made the king, Bertie didn't do the Christmas speech, as his father had made a tradition of doing. Bertie was afraid of being compared to his father, and he was afraid of the microphone. Bertie stated it wouldn't be an annual event. So his speech therapist, Logue, helped Bertie by working with him frequently, and the king rehearsed with the BBC's Robert Wood, who set up the broadcasting room. Elizabeth helped Bertie to write the speech. They worked together as a team, and if they didn't like how something sounded, they would go away and work on it until they got it the way they wanted it. On December 25th, 1937, Bertie lit a cigarette and began to pace. He tossed the butt in the fireplace, and he waited for the red light and started to speak. His family listened on the radio in the nursery upstairs. He only stumbled on one word, and the speech was a success. So I'm going to end the video now. So this episode showed how Bertie and Elizabeth overcame their fears and began their reign in the UK. David leaving the country was a big headache for the couple, and they finally got things under control, denying his demands. Elizabeth and Bertie made the monarchy less formal, with not having their children curtsy to them, and Bertie relied on his own judgment regarding work, and he also got advice from Elizabeth instead of relying on prime ministers. It took Bertie and Elizabeth a little while to get into the rhythm of how to handle being king and queen, but once they did, they were the dynamic duo. So I hope you will join me in the next video to find out even more of what they did, not only in their duties to the country, but how they were with their family too. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. So I wish everybody a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.